Really, John in Bristol, I'd like you both to listen. I'd like you all to listen to a spokesperson for Republicans overseas, Erol Morkoc. Good morning, Erol.
Oh, dear.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me.
What a welcome from John in Bristol. I don't know if you heard that. How embarrassed are you on a scale of 1 to 10, Erol, by your president?
0. Why would I be embarrassed? I'm confused by the question.
Oh,
Can you be more clear? What would I be embarrassed about?
voting him in for a start.
Well, John Bolton, former White House security advisor, said Mr. Trump's remarks some of the most shameful ever made by a U.S. president. Why is he behaving like Putin's poodle?
Well, I mean, I say that's your perspective. Trump's calculation
Not
is very
necessarily.
straightforward. It is, because that's your saying it. I'm not going to give you my perspective. So Trump's calculation is very straightforward. As long as Russia knows the U.S. will bankroll Ukraine indefinitely, Putin has no incentive to seriously negotiate. And as long as Zelensky knows the U.S. aid is flowing, he feels no pressure to make tough concessions. Trump's mindset is informed by the lessons from the 20th century. World War I, for example, it dragged on for years, destroyed a generation because leaders refused to negotiate. Vietnam could have ended earlier if politicians didn't fear the optics of compromise. So strategic pragmatism says, when a stalemate looms, you need to negotiate. And hard-nosed negotiations are how you end wars. Look at Richard Nixon, for example, in the Paris Peace Accords to extricate the U.S. from Vietnam. Look at Eisenhower ending the Korean War in '53 through a negotiated armistice rather than chasing total victory. In both cases, the U.S. leaders realized an imperfect peace was better than endless bloodshed. Better to secure peace now, even one with painful compromises, than to gamble on open-ended war.
What's the compromise? What's Russia's compromise? Painful compromises. What's Russia going to compromise?
Well, Russia has taken about 20% of Europe it's part of Europe, of Ukrainian territory.
Yeah.
They have lost hundreds of thousands of people who are there willing to
in the peace negotiations, what would their compromise be?
Well, they have quite a bit of leverage. So their compromise would be likely to, I guess, if you have to really think about it, they would have to end their aggression. There would have to be new lines drawn. They're going to keep everything they took in the East, by the way, unless you want to send 500,000 British soldiers and 500,000 American soldiers over there and fight a war against the Russian Empire, which is unwise. They will keep what they've done. America, the West, NATO has lost this conflict. So Russia now has 20% of Ukraine, and there's not a lot we can do with it.
NATO has lost this conflict.
Oh, absolutely. If they had won the conflict, you wouldn't have lost 20% of Ukraine. You wouldn't have lost all of the actual mineral value of Ukraine. So you have Kyiv. Congratulations. You've lost the war because you made a deal with Victoria Nuland and people like John Bolton who belong in The Hague, and these people are out. And now there's America First policies here, and America First wants peace.
How's Make Russia Great Again going? Pretty good.
Who cares about Russia? Russia's a poor, miserable country. It's run by a dictator. These are barbarian people who attack their neighbors, and they're not
barbarian people.
Yes, if they've attacked Ukraine. They've slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. That's a barbarous, vicious country, and it's a country that we definitely don't want to enter into World War III against, my friend. That's a nuclear country that can put a hypersonic missile in London in 5 minutes if they wanted to. So be very careful when you poke that bear.
Don't poke the bear. We've been listening to that one since Peter the Great, haven't we? James Cartledge, what would you say, James, to the Erol there from your sister party, the Republicans?
Well, I think that, I actually go back to what Patrick
Sharp intake of breath. Go on.
I go back to what
Tell
Patrick
us what
said
you really think for once,
earlier.
politician, Mr. Politician. Go on. You heard it.
Yeah. I go back to what Patrick said earlier, if I may, in answering this point from the gentleman representing the Republicans, if I may, which is he spoke about the difference between the rhetoric and the reality, right? And this is something I was sort of hinting at when I first spoke on your program earlier. And the reality is that, the US is threatened here because if Russia is seen to, inverted commas, win from any settlement that concludes this, and we hope there is peace at some point, but if they are seen to win, that will send a signal to other potential adversaries, including China.
Said that.
And what that will do is it will embolden those countries. It's not just the UK and Europe that's under threat here. We all need to, the reason we have NATO is that we all stand together against the threats we face. The only time Article 5 of NATO has ever been used was after 9/11, when the US used it, and we came to support them. We went out into the Middle East as part of the war on terror. And I think the key point is we're better when we stand together. The one point I would make in terms of those last remarks is NATO has had no involvement whatsoever in the war in Ukraine. It's a war between Ukraine and Russia as sovereign states. What many sovereign countries have done is to group together to provide munitions to Ukraine, and of course the US has played a huge role in that. And we've done that to avoid the complete capitulation of Ukraine, which would have been an absolute disaster for every country in the West, including the United States.
Mark and Shirley. Hello, Mark. What do you think about what's going on in the world with Mr. Trump? And what do you think about what you're hearing in our little world on the nation's phone-in? Mark, good morning.
Well, interesting points. I'm actually apolitical. I just, therefore, try to look from afar at the negotiations that Donald Trump is putting forward, both in Gaza and in Ukraine, in respect to both those. And you can't call it a pattern. There's only two jurisdictions here that we're talking about, but it does seem that he has chosen to side with the more powerful military nations in both cases. And one could hypothetically say also it's in the US commercial interest to side with the Russians and Israel. However, that is hypothetical. The point I wanted to make was, if there is a pattern emerging here of just buddy up with the stronger nation who can help the US economy, then what would happen if China were to invade Taiwan? Would the same pattern be followed? Simply say, well, China are powerful, Taiwan are weak, therefore we will support the bigger nation. Because it doesn't seem right to me, as a right-thinking human being, that you always side with the stronger at the cost of the weaker.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. And Erol, it's all about minerals. It's the earth minerals. It's the resources, isn't it, Erol, from Republicans' overseas spokesperson? It's all about that, as it is in Greenland, as it is in Canada. It's America first. Get your hands on that lovely stuff. Yeah.
You make a good point. The people who were there before us and who definitely expanded this situation, we're very happy to trade. I think it was the mineral rights of Ukraine for BlackRock, right? So they've been trying to strip mine Ukraine from both sides. The Russians have come in from one side, and the American neocons came in from the other. And they used the Ukrainians. They tricked them, and they told them they would have unlimited, unfettered aid from the United States of America for a non-NATO country, which, by the way, isn't quite the same thing as Taiwan, but that's also another serious situation because you do have emboldenment around the world. Mm-hmm. When you look at, as you brought up, Greenland, there's a lot of rare earth minerals there. Ton of rare earth minerals there, very critical. Canada has been effectively like a place where the Western Alliance has locked up the majority of resources in this frozen tundra with a population of like 30 million people. So of course it's all about resources. And that's why Vladimir Putin is happy to take just the East, because that's where all of the resources that really are valuable in the Ukraine are. So he got what he wanted. And the Americans, unfortunately, we're played like a fiddle by Mr. Putin. And now we're here having to try to clean up the mess that's been left to us by an incompetent, expansionist, imperial America that we are ending. Marco Rubio came out and said there is no more indispensable nation. This is a multipolar, multifaceted world order, and we need to look out for our people and our interests.
Do you think that Mr. Putin should be welcomed back into the G7, for example?
I mean, it's such an interesting question. Any group that Russia is in, by default, they're almost the most important member of the group because of size and because of minerals. So you're talking about welcoming somebody back. I mean, on all ethical counts, no. But in the end, he is the acting czar of the Russian Empire. So what are you going to do? Not talk to him? Well, that ends up with 1 million dead people. These are human beings, by the way. Lindsey Graham can go out and talk about all he wants. Oh, we're gumming up the Russian war machine. All these dead Russians. Well, those are people's kids. Those are human beings, and nobody wants to see war. And we're looking for detente. And that's where America's going.
Former American ambassador to Denmark the other night, very, very much a MAGA person, a Trump supporter, she said there are more political prisoners in the UK than there are in Russia. And some people might say, what nonsense you people come out with.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more referring to the free speech situation, which is an issue for us with our allies. If our allies don't share our fundamental values, then it starts to be questionable for us. So when we see people getting locked up for online tweets or pray next to some clinic, I think that's where she's pointing that direction. I understand how that might miff you, but that is the perspective we have.
That's your perspective, yes, but you want free speech. Listen in more often. Thank you. It's 9:36. News coming up.